Carolyn will now take over and tell you what government actually ended up doing.
So we had this season of reviews. We had the tax working group. There were some other reviews which we haven't covered today in terms of the capital markets development task force. There was the Henry review going on in Australia. So what basically did the government decide to do? Well, the first indications we had in terms of the direction of the budget was the Prime Minister's speech in February of this year, where he came out and basically gave an indication of what they were thinking. He indicated that they agreed with the tax working group in terms of the concerns of integrity, fairness, and providing the right incentives for people. Talked about aims for tax reform in terms of providing the right incentives for people to work hard and to save. But they also wanted to make sure that any tax reform was perceived as fair. They did rule out some of the more controversial suggestions that the tax working group had made. They said that they weren't going to introduce a capital gains tax, they weren't going to introduce land tax, and they weren't interested in this RFRM idea for rental property. However, they did say that they were committed to certain things in terms of the budget. They didn't want to hit the property sector and make sure that they were going to get more tax revenue, with this perception that they weren't. There was a lot of money. There was a lot of money invested, and they weren't. The government was actually paying out money to property investors rather than collecting tax. They wanted to reduce personal taxes to make sure that people had incentives to work harder. They didn't want to make any radical changes to working for families. They confirmed that. But if they did go the route of increasing GST, they would compensate particularly those on low incomes and benefits. So that was kind of direction that the Prime Minister indicated, which set the objectives for the budget. As David said, when the national government got into power, we had a global financial crisis hit, these projections of big deficits. So in terms of any tax reform, it definitely needed to be fiscally neutral, to be responsible. There was no way they were going to hand out massive tax cuts without finding another way to fund them. So it was going to be a balanced package. They were going to give some, and they were going to raise revenue in terms of what they were thinking of doing. In terms of being able to lower the rates, what that meant is they would need to broaden the tax base in some way. If you're going to collect less in terms of rate, you need to have a bigger pie that you're collecting it over. And they were definitely interested in terms of broadening the tax base from property. They wanted to improve integrity. Inland Revenue in particular had briefed the incoming minister in terms of problems with integrity in the system. The amount of income that was being sheltered in trusts, the problems with working for families, that certain parties were using their property losses to claim greater amounts of working for families. The fact that on a survey of the top New Zealand income earners, that only half of them were paying the top tax rate. You know, there's real integrity concerns in the system and the need for people to feel that the system was fair. They're also concerned in terms of international competitiveness. We're obviously competing in particular with Australia for labour, for capital, and we need to make sure that our tax system is competitive. As I said, the Henry review was going on in Australia. We didn't know exactly where that was going to go. There were rumours the company tax rate could go to 25%, and so the government was needing to balance that in terms of any tax reform that it was considering. So I'm sure you've all seen in the media in terms of the broad outline of the package, but I'm just going to cover it briefly and try and explain why some of the things are there, what the thinking was behind it, and then we'll have time for questions in terms of anything that you might have thought of already in terms of potential impacts for your business. So the first thing was a switch from income tax to consumption taxes, or GST. The kind of thinking behind that is if you earn your labour income, you earn income from savings, you pay income tax. So they were wanting to reduce the rate of that income tax through the personal tax cuts. Instead, they increased the rate of GST, but the idea behind that is that only hits when you consume. So if you save your money, you're not paying GST. So it's a way of trying to encourage people to save rather than consume. They've reduced personal tax rates, and that occurs from 1 October. So our new tax scale is 10.5% at the lowest incomes, 17.5%, which is about at the average wage, 30%, and then the top rate will now be 33%. There was quite a lot of speculation before the budget day as to what the new rate structure might look like. And one thing that people really didn't pick was that 17.5%, the drop from 21 down to 17.5%. And the kind of thinking behind that is that's about where the average wage hits. So the government didn't want to be seen as just giving a tax cut to very high income earners or just compensating those on very low incomes. It wanted to be seen as tax cuts across the board so that everybody was better off. As well as just reducing the rates from 1 October, the legislation that was passed on Friday also makes a number of consequential changes. So there are changes to the PAYE rules, changes to provisional tax so that people can get immediate, if you're a provisional taxpayer, you get immediate access to that tax cut. Changes to RWT on interest to make sure those rates are aligned with the new personal rates. Changes to PIE rates, so if you're investing through a PIE, that is equivalent to the new lower personal rates, and changes to equity to lower those as well to take into account the income tax cuts. The other side of that switch from income tax to consumption was obviously the increase in the GST rate from 12.5 to 15 from 1 October. It's probably the worst kept secret in history that was likely to happen. I think the government was quite concerned in terms of the public reaction to increasing GST. Obviously, it's perceived as a regressive tax, a tax that hits lower income people more than higher income people. So I think they wanted to foreshadow that was likely to happen. The Prime Minister made it clear that they were going to compensate those on lower incomes to make sure that they were no worse off from the GST increase. And so all of the key benefits are also being increased from 1 October to take into account the impact of that GST rise. One of the interesting things that the tax working group and officials and ministers debated in considering increasing GST to 15% was how high can you go? New Zealand's got the broadest GST system in the world. We get very few things that are actually exempt from GST. The concern is the higher that rate goes, the more pressure to accept things like food or other necessities, which is quite common in other countries. As soon as you start doing that, you get a much more complex system, a much more inefficient system. So we were very keen to maintain our broad, simple GST. And it was felt that at 15% we would be able to do that. The tax working group did carry out some sort of equity analysis to say, well, if we did exempt basic foodstuffs, what would that do to the system? Would it make it much more equitable for people on lower incomes? The result of that is it doesn't actually have a very big impact on equity at all, but it would mean that a GST of 15% with a food exemption would raise less money than the 12.5% system across the board. And if you're looking to use part of that GST rate increase to fund your tax cuts, there's no way you can do that if you start to bring in exemptions. In terms of the company changes that were included in the tax package, I think this is probably the biggest surprise for people. When David and I were at lock-up with the media and with the sort of tax commentators like John Schuins, they had no idea that the company tax rate was going to drop down to 28%. They were pretty surprised by it, particularly after the Australian government in their budget had announced about 10 days before that they were only going to start thinking of decreasing their company tax rate in a couple of years' time. So at that point they didn't think New Zealand would do anything. What people may be a bit surprised at is we don't put budgets together in the last couple of weeks. The decisions are made in very early April. So there was no way we knew at that point what Australia was going to do. And the government just made the decision that it was going to drop the company tax rate. And the kind of two main reasons for that were that some of the other changes in the package are perceived as bad for business, or hitting business in terms of the depreciation changes in particular. And it wanted to be seen as having a balanced package for everybody. Didn't want to be seen as giving lots of money to individuals and collecting lots of money off business. It wanted to also give something back to business. So by reducing the company tax rate, it was a way of balancing things out. The second kind of driver is obviously international competitiveness. It's got an eye on what's happening in Australia, what's happening in Asia Pacific. We want to attract foreign capital here, and so it was, at 30% we're at the very top end of OECD in terms of our company tax rate, and so decreasing it to 28 was a way of making us a bit more competitive.